Thanks everybody for coming tonight, for joining our webinar on the Okefenokee Swamp and how the proposed mine is going to threaten this unique ecosystem. I'm Dottie Head, I'm the Director of Communications for Georgia Audubon, and Georgia Audubon's pleased to be hosting this event tonight. This event is being closed captioned for your convenience. You can just click on the CC button and choose show subtitles, and you should be able to see the subtitles if that's something that you would like to take advantage of. If you have any questions, please ask them in the question and answer box, not in the chat box, and we will do our best. I will relay them to the presenters at the end of the presentation. We're going to let each of the presenters get through their slides, and then we'll hold the questions for the end and try to get them all answered. And if we can't get them answered live, then we'll try to get the answers to you later. We can download the Q&A transcript and send it along with the recording that we're making of this video, and we'll send out an email with a link to both the webinar and the questions and answers in case you'd like to share it or to watch it again. Let's see, and I think that's all my announcements. I am going to introduce the panelists tonight. We have Bob Sherrier from the Southern Environmental Law Center, Charles McMillan from the Georgia Conservancy, Christian Hunt from Defenders of Wildlife, Adam Betchel from Georgia, and Mark Mandica from the Amphibian Foundation. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Bob and let him get started.
Thanks, Dottie. Hi, everyone. My name is Bob Sherrier. I'm an associate attorney at the Southern Environmental Law Center in Atlanta. I work mostly on coastal and wetlands and water issues in Georgia, and I've been involved in this matter here for nearly 2 years now. But before I jump into the three topics I want to cover, which are kind of regional heavy mineral sands mining, the reason Twin Pines is now back in the spotlight, and what the Georgia EPD is up to, I just wanted to pause real quick on this picture of the Spanish moss on pines in the swamp. I took this on a trip in 2019, and I just love Spanish moss. It's a different angle to the beauty of the swamp with for all the critters talk that we're going to have later, and I think it really adds to the mysterious feeling of the swamp, and I just like this picture. So next slide, please. We can jump right in. So this is a map showing the Okefenokee Swamp in relation to other heavy mineral sands mines. Generally speaking, these mines work by digging up the sand deposits from ancient barrier island complexes, spinning out the minerals with higher levels of valuable stuff in them, and then putting the homogenized sands back into the pits. You'll note that most of the mining, those dark orange splotches, has occurred far from the swamp on these other sand ridges or down in Florida. DuPont proposed to mine these lighter orange tracts on the northern side of the swamp there in the late 90s. They eventually walked away without breaking any ground after the public rose up in opposition against this idea. The public was clear that this is the wrong place for a mine, and DuPont even retired the mineral rights on the northern edge there, those diagonally shaded ones. Next slide, please. So this is the Twin Pines site in red. In relation to the swamp and Trail Ridge, which is what contains the minerals. The darker shades are higher elevation. You can see that the swamp is about 50 feet lower than the very top of the ridge. This map also shows the property just to the north of Twin Pines, shaded orange there. That's owned by Toledo Manufacturing, and it has minerals on it as well. Next slide, please. So before I go into kind of the history of the proposals here and the kind of major events so far, this is a direct quote from describing Twin Pines' plans. Although I'll explain in a moment, Twin Pines did not have the mining rights to about 4,000 acres on the west-hand side there. But I included this because Twin Pines has repeatedly avoided answering questions about the impacts of the full mining operation. And it's something to keep in mind as we go through these various proposals on the next slide. So this is an overview of all the various proposed mine shapes so far over the past several years. And we'll go through these one by one, but it's also, this is why there have been multiple comment periods to date. So the next slide has the original first phase proposed by Twin Pines. You can see that the wetlands on that tract are directly connected to the swamp. There was not an official permit application for this, but this was what was proposed to the federal agencies at the outset. The next slide shows what was submitted for the first application in July 2019. This is the mining area. It was about just over 1,200 acres. About half of that was wetlands. In December of 2019, after the comment period for that closed, the Corps of Engineers told Twin Pines that an environmental impact statement would be required to evaluate the project. Environmental impact statements, or EISs, are supposed to take a hard look at all the potential impacts, including the cumulative impacts of the entire, mine at full build out. According to the Corps', emails, Twin Pines, in a meeting with them, was adamant that an EIS was unacceptable for its business, and so Twin Pines withdrew this application and went to the next one. So last year, just before all the lockdowns started, Twin Pines resubmitted a new application for what it called a demonstration mine, slightly smaller, exact same location. You can note that it still included some TIAA lands out to the west there. TIAA found out and was upset and wrote a letter to the Corps asking to be removed from the proposal. Around that time, Twin Pines became the poster child for the new definition of federally protected waters. That's the waters of the United States, or WOTUS. And this next slide will show kind of the scale of the wetlands that lost protections. So the green shapes there were delineated as federally protected wetlands by the Corps. After the new rule came out that changed the definition, these darker green areas got reevaluated and were determined that they were no longer federally protected. It's about 377 acres that no longer require a federal permit before they can be excavated. Twin Pines withdrew its federal permit application after this happened. And on the next slide, you can see that they changed shapes to kind of avoid hitting any federal waters and avoid the federal permitting process entirely. This is the mine shape that is in front of Georgia EPD for permitting right now. It is about 4 years worth of that 30-year project, 577 acres, over 300 acres of wetlands there. I mean, it's not like the wetlands disappeared, they just no longer had federal protections. And the next slide kind of shows you all of them together. This is incredibly close to the refuge and even closer to the swamp, which, as you can see, those green again are the wetlands, and they don't abide by the property lines. The swamp itself kind of sprawls out up onto the ridge. These are very closely connected systems. All right, got one last slide. So here is where we are now. Twin Pines has 5 pending permit applications in front of the Georgia EPD. EPD is accepting comments right now, which we will come back to at the end of this webinar. The current step is this MLUP plus, as I've shorthanded it here. What that is EPD is asking for a environmental provisions addendum to the mining land use plan. It's unclear right now what all will be included in that addendum, but they will put it out for official comment likely later this summer or the fall, once they receive sufficient materials from Twin Pines to do that. Then they'll address those comments, determine whether or not to put out a draft permit for comment, and that'll be another round of comments, and then they'll make a permitting decision. I realize that's a lot of information in a very short amount of time. I think that the takeaways are that we're talking about the first phase of a much larger project that no longer requires federal review, and EPD needs to hear from the public right now to help them make the right call here. And with that, I will pass the Zoom microphone to Mr. Charles McMillan. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you, Bob. And at the end of this, if you have any difficult questions, we'll make sure to get them to Bob. Thank you. This is, I'm glad Bob gave that introduction. To experience the Okefenokee is extraordinary. And going back to the formation and the group that's been working on this, that so many of you have been hearing from and many of you have been a part of, is the Okefenokee Protection Alliance. It's a coalition that formed over concerns that center on the Okefenokee's protection. We're a recently formed coalition over the last year and a half. The protection and conservation related to the National Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge and its associated rivers and wetlands is our purpose. The next slide will show you that we had, this group formed very quickly over a couple of alarming issues. This is a kind of a cartoon representation of the humate layers and sand that make up Trail Ridge, and that homogenized soil that Bob referred to, when it's placed back after the mining process, Twin Pines has not been able to explain to Okefenokee Protection Alliance or the federal or state agencies in sufficient detail and conclusive about terms about what the damage will be to both Trail Ridge and possibly to the water in the Okefenokee itself, including the water level. The next peak shows you a little bit about, everybody's going to be an expert about Trail Ridge by the time they leave this webinar. And the next slide shows you a little bit of shows you on those tracks that Bob's been referring to, the mineral rich areas are outlined in this black form. That's the highest content areas that have the heavy minerals on it. So when we started seeing some of this initial information came out, this coalition quickly formed. Next slide, please, Dottie. Because one of the things we've seen is that Trail Ridge goes all the way down, basically from Jessup, Georgia, down to Stark, Florida. This gives you a little bit of context. The light lines are the State Wildlife Action Plan. The State Wildlife Action Plan for Florida and Georgia actually connect together here on Trail Ridge because it's an ecological corridor and informs the eastern sill for the Okefenokee, separating it from the St. Mary's River. Next slide, please. Between Stark, we've seen this problem progressing from Florida over the last, since World War II. The 23, the two blue dots that you see on the slide are Stark, Florida and McClaney, Florida, which are 23 miles apart. They've mined this entire reach working north from start, going north, this next slide, Dottie, over since World War II, and they haven't been very good stewards. So the second thing that we saw was that we're going to get more of the same. Any of you that have driven on 301 down to Gainesville, Florida, have seen some of this over the years. Next slide, please, Dottie. So this is the water. Some of you that canoe know that there's two great headwaters. There's Okefenokee is the headwaters for two of Georgia's iconic rivers, the Suwannee on the west side and the St. Mary's on the east side. This mine proposal is very close and actually has a direct hydraulic connection to the River Styx and the North Fork of North Prong of the St. Mary's River. So all these issues contributed to a lot of concern that started in July 2018 and prior to that when we first understood about this project coming forward. Next slide, please. So the coalition has responded. We've had great response and participation from all these member organizations and their supporters. We had 44,000 commenters from all 50 states. This is a map that shows you in March 2020 where our responses and letters of concern to the Corps of Engineers went. Florida, Georgia, and California are the dark red. Those are the states with the highest level of responses. It was just almost an unprecedented amount of response for a project in the state of Georgia, certainly more than I've ever been involved with during my years of doing this kind of work. And next slide shows us the logos that we're very proud of. This is off of our website. And we're very proud of this group that we've put together, and we every group on this logo has done their little part to help protect the Okefenokee. The issue at hand is this Twin Pines, and with that, I'll turn it off. We'll move on to talking some about some of the critters and habitat, which I know is why everybody's really here.
Thank you, Charles. Hey guys, my name's Christian Hunt. I work for Defenders of Wildlife, which is sort of, as the name implies, a national conservation organization. We're focused on imperiled species primarily, as well as the habitats that they depend upon, especially those within the National Wildlife Refuge system. Next slide, please, Dottie. So, you know, one thing I like to point out when I'm talking about why this place is special is that as far as wetlands go, wetlands of large scale and wetlands on a global scale, there aren't really many places that compare to the Okefenokee anymore in terms of their size, in terms of their health and wildlife abundance. And I would argue that really in the United States, we have two major wetland ecosystems left. One being the Okefenokee, the other being the Everglades. They do, despite the fact that they're pretty close to one another, however, share a lot of differences, particularly in their health. The Everglades is a place that is undoubtedly still very rich in wildlife, but it is also a place that has been very heavily impacted by development, by agriculture over the years. You know, we have tinkered too much with the Everglades, and because of that, it does not support nearly the wildlife abundance that it once did. Whereas the Okefenokee is kind of an interesting case study in that it really stands alone in its health. You know, this place has not been compromised yet by industry, and it essentially still exists as it has for millennia. And because of that, it's still hyper rich in wildlife diversity and abundance, and is considered, again, one of the largest intact freshwater ecosystems that this planet has left. Next slide, please. And you know, it's hard to state exactly how many species reside within the swamp, but it is safe to say it's thousands. It's suspected that there might be over 1,000 species of moths alone, which I think is just an incredibly fun fact. And, you know, partly because of that, the reason behind part of that is the fact that, you know, this place is not spoiled by night pollution. You know, you can go out in the Okefenokee and still witness these incredible deep night skies, but it's also home to a lot of imperiled species. On the top left there, one of them is the eastern indigo snake. It's the longest snake in North America. It's a species that once had a very wide range across the Southeast. It's dependent upon longleaf pine ecosystems, as is on the right there, the red-cockaded woodpecker. Both of those animals have suffered massive losses, but in the Okefenokee, they still find habitat. You know, they still find a high quality ecosystem. On the bottom left there is a species that does not live right now within the Okefenokee, but that is the Florida panther. Florida panther, I think, is kind of a misnomer because this animal once had a much wider range. And it's largely relegated to South Florida right now. But the general consensus is that for this animal to recover, it's going to have to take up residence in the greater Okefenokee ecosystem, whether that's through active reintroduction or natural recolonization, you name it. And the greater Okefenokee ecosystem actually is the #1 priority reintroduction site for the Florida panther. And again, that's mainly due to the fact that it's still healthy. You know, the refuge itself is over 400,000 acres. It's connected to other public lands and it has private lands, and altogether that stitches together about 1 million acres of very good habitat for species that require large territories like the Florida panther. Next slide, please. And, you know, because of all of these qualities, the Okefenokee has, it's really earned pretty much all the superlatives at this point. You know, it's one of Georgia's 7 natural wonders. It's a national wildlife refuge. It's a national wilderness area, which means there's no road building or logging permitted within its boundaries. It's a United Nations Wetland of International Importance. And really excitingly, it's the first refuge in this country, and bear in mind there are nearly 600 refuge units, that is poised to potentially become a World Heritage Site. World Heritage Sites are, it's a rare designation that's essentially reserved for the best of the best. In the United States, only a handful of natural sites have earned that designation, and those are places like the Redwoods and the Grand Canyon and Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So really, you know, these iconic landmarks. Next slide, please, Dottie. But this place is important to wildlife, but it's also important from a carbon storage perspective. Throughout the swamp are peat accumulations, and peat stores a lot of carbon. And one of the fears from mining is that if operations do lower the water table, it will result in a drying out of the peat. And that could lead to increased wildfires, which would thereby result in the offloading of peat and carbon into the atmosphere, thereby hastening the climate change crisis. And again, you know, this is also, as you can see from that icon on the right, just important lifeboat habitat. You know, throughout the Southeast, we're witnessing massive destruction of habitat. You know, it is rampant. It is resulting in the diminishment of our wild places and hastening the extinction crisis. But the Okefenokee is really one of those last great wildlife cores where we can sustain these species and also give them, in the long term, an opportunity to recolonize areas outside the Okefenokee should we elect to protect more areas, should we elect to restore more habitat. So with that said, I want to now hand it off to Adam, who is with Georgia Audubon, to talk a little more about wildlife and specifically the birds of the Okefenokee.
Thank you, Christian. Yeah, good evening, everybody. My name is Adam Betchell. I'm the Conservation Director for Georgia. And I got the amazing, I threw the bobwhite quail on here, northern bobwhite. It's a bird you're probably familiar with, especially if you grew up in a smaller town or out on a farm. You know, a bird that we all know, their bobwhite call, you ring loud across, you know, farmlands across this country, but a bird that's experienced an 80% decline over the past 40 or 50 years. Unfortunately, like many of our songbirds and game birds like this. So it's a bird that's very common still at the Okefenokee and nearby area. Okay, sorry about that if I froze. I saw Charles froze it there. I was just talking about how the bobwhite has unfortunately experienced a steep decline, though it's still common around the edges of the swamp. Next slide, Dottie. All right, can you all hear me? I'm sorry, it seems like there was a... All right, hopefully we're good. It seems like people aren't frozen. All right, sorry about that. So I wanted to point out that one of the original purposes of designating the Okefenokee as a wildlife refuge was to provide a refuge and breeding grounds for the birds that do swamp in nearby longleaf pine home. The birds have always to this refuge and to the overall of the swamp. Next slide, Dottie, if you can hear me. Oh. All right, I'm really sorry. One of it's really choppy. Let me turn off my video just in case that helps. So what are some of the birds that we do get down at the Okefenokee? There's a great diversity. Building off of what Christian said, it's kind of hard to get an accurate count of all the species that are there, but for the birds specifically, there are hundreds and hundreds of different species that call the swamp home for at least part of the year. Next slide. All right, so well over 200 species have been documented using the swamp. Yeah, sorry about that. Between 220, 240, somewhere in that neighborhood is where the species total lives right now. Of course, if you're dealing with a swamp, if you're dealing with an area with so much water, the wading birds are gonna be present in big numbers. So green herons, white ibis, even an American bittern, the bottom photo there, is a bird that you can find commonly throughout the winter, depending on the water levels. So it's a great area for the herons and egrets and hingas and all those water-loving birds, again, that you might expect to be at a swamp. Next slide. In addition to those, we have some of the kind of charismatic, well-known species that can be found throughout the state. Numerous woodpeckers, including the pileated, our largest woodpecker that's still around here in Georgia. Red-shouldered hawks and many other raptors are found across the total of barred owls. I was just camping down at the Okefenokee a couple weeks ago, and the barred owls were everywhere. So many upland birds and raptors as well call the swamp home. Next slide. And in addition to the water birds and the larger birds, the songbirds are there in big numbers as well. We have dozens of migratory songbirds, especially the warblers, like that American redstart on the far left there, the Halloween bird, black and orange. That's a bird that uses the swamp during migration. You have birds like the ruby-crowned kinglet on the right, which is just a winter visitor, but exists in large numbers during the cooler months. And then something like the yellow-throated warbler, which is the bottom photo, that breeds in great numbers throughout the swamp. They're just a few representatives of these smaller songbirds that call the swamp home. Next, Dottie. Goodness. So in addition to that kind of broad overview of some of the species, I wanted to talk about a few of the focal birds that make this place special. One of those is the Sandhill Crane. You can see from the range map here that the birds breed in those orangey red parts of North America, primarily up through Canada, but you will see some pockets of purple, especially down in Florida and just barely into southeast Georgia. Sandhill cranes are primarily migratory, but there is a non-migratory, a stationary population in the southeast. And in Georgia, pretty much the only spot that you're going to find breeding sandhill cranes is in the Okefenokee swamp. So it's a bird that's special to this location and one that relies on its protection to thrive in our state. Next. In addition to the sandhill crane, another bird that could be called a swamp warbler. This is the prothonotary warbler, another bird that is in great numbers throughout the Okefenokee swamp. They're the only warbler or small songbird like this in the eastern US that nests in nest cavities like the bird on the right there. So it needs and relies upon the standing dead trees of a swamp or of a wetland to flourish. And again, a bird that's tightly connected to the Okefenokee. Next. Another amazing bird that calls the southeast home, the swallowtail kite, a bird that is declined somewhat due to habitat loss, as has the prothonotary warbler. These birds breed in and around the swamp as well as migrate over in big numbers looking for large insects and other items. Swamplands of the southeast, specifically in the coastal plain of Georgia, they really rely on good, strong, intact habitat to flourish. Next. The red-cockaded woodpecker is one that Christian mentioned earlier. We also have the Bachman sparrow. These are two birds that are really tied to the longleaf pine ecosystem, and without intact and fire-maintained longleaf, neither of these birds can continue to thrive. They're birds that are both in trouble or declined greatly over the past few decades, but birds that do still exist around the Okefenokee. Next. So what are some of the threats? If this mine were to go through, how might birds be impacted? One was the way that Charles mentioned that the hydrology could be altered. Some of the birds I mentioned earlier, the prothonotary warbler, the sandhill crane, they both nest on or just above standing water. So if the hydrology was, more water, less water, that could affect their breeding success. I mentioned all the wading birds as well. If there were less small aquatic prey, whether it be fish, invertebrates, herps, amphibians and reptiles, any of that could have a great impact on the birds that of course flourish in the swamp because of that standing water, the biodiversity that lives within it. Next. In addition to the potential hydrological changes, light can have an impact on our birds. The Okefenokee is a well-known dark skies gold standard location. And so whatever lighting might be abound because of a potential mine, it's not only going to confuse and disorient migrating birds, but it can affect the circadian rhythms, the breeding success, and the behavior of all the birds that nest in those locations as well. So migratory birds and breeding species could both be impacted in a multitude of ways because of ambient light pollution that just doesn't exist in that part of the state right now. And next, Dottie. And similar to light, sound as well. Sound can affect breeding success. It's been shown to affect how much hatching a nest can have. It can affect their behavior, when birds sing, at what pitch and frequency sing. So again, this is already being experienced by birds in more urban areas, but if we think about the solitude and the the quietness of the Okefenokee, the sound of a running plant at all times can really impact the birds that have lived in that ecosystem for such a long time. Next. Now, all of this, this is a relatively isolated case. It's one part of one swamp in one state. But in general, our birds are in trouble. In the past 50 years, we've lost about 3 billion birds, or around 25% of all the avian life in our country. And they're getting hit from all fronts. It's already tough for a bird out there, finding good nesting sites, finding a suitable mate, dodging predators. Then on top of that, we have light pollution and noise pollution. We've had habitat loss. And as Christian mentioned, the Okefenokee is such a phenomenal, well-intact habitat. It's so special in the way it remains as a somewhat unaltered swampland. And so we need to really preserve these special places because our birds are already feeling these pressures from so many other areas all the time. And so we cannot lose these intact, large, prolific spaces for our wildlife. Next. And finally, and I apologize for my poor connection tonight, I wanted to close before kicking it off to Mark Mandika of the Amphibian Foundation with this photo of an ivory-billed woodpecker. If you're a bird person, you may know of this species. It is thought to have gone extinct in the 1940s, though there was some potential glimpses of them in the past few decades. But I was camping for the first time at Stephen C. Foster State Park just a couple weeks ago in the Okefenokee, and I saw cypress trees that were hundreds of years old. And undoubtedly at some point, the now extinct ivory-billed woodpecker probably landed upon these cypress trees. They probably nested in these cavities. And of course, this one mine is probably not going to lead to the extinction of a species, but it provides a learning experience for us to actually go and see the history, the health of this swamp, and also past mistakes that we have made with birds, not providing them the protections that they need. And so when we think about the Okefenokee swamp from a bird perspective, it's impossible to not think of these amazing creatures that have already left us and those that are greatly imperiled, and how we need to protect this habitat for them and for all other wildlife. So thank you all very much, and I'll pass it on to Mark.
All right. Thanks, everybody. My name is Mark Mandika, and I am the Executive Director and co-founder of the Amphibian Foundation based in Atlanta. We focus primarily on imperiled amphibian species native to the southeast and predominantly in the southeastern coastal plain, which of course includes the Okefenokee. So I am originally from the Northeast, and I did my graduate work in the Everglades, and in preparation for moving down to Florida, one of my favorite books was the Life History of Frogs of the Okefenokee, and I would fantasize about what it must be like there, being from the Northeast and not having that many amphibians, and always being excited by them. But, it's been covered already tonight how unique the Okefenokee is, and our amphibians are one of the many reasons why it is so unique. The communities there and in the coastal plain are just magnificent. And those are some of our most imperiled amphibian species, are the ones that live right along there, and the ones that we spend most of our time trying to conserve. I have some maps here that I got from DNR, just kind of demonstrating the biodiversity of amphibians and reptiles, and so that you can see just, the fall line that cuts right through Georgia there, and in all three of these range maps here, just showing how biodiversity spikes as you move southward into Georgia. And that, there are lots of species. I highlighted them here. So there's almost 100 species of amphibians and reptiles that would be native to the Okefenokee region and the longleaf pine ecosystem. I think that's good. Next slide, Donnie. Thank you. And so, I wanted to also point out some of the major threats, and number one here in the Southeast is habitat loss and degradation, and that hits right on what we're talking about tonight with preserving this rare and unique ecosystem. And then some of the other major threats like disease and parasitism, global climate change, unsustainable use, introduced and invasive species, in pollution and malicious killing, and these all connect directly to, if changes were made to the hydrology and the ecosystem of the Okefenokee as well. These other factors, which may not be direct causes, could become severely exacerbated if the habitat loss came into play, or fragmentation, and putting all these extra stressors on these already imperiled species. And so it's just important to think about it in terms like that. The Okefenokee is relatively intact, as opposed to where I did my graduate work in the Everglades, which was a wetland, kind of a disaster. And as far as the amphibian communities there, it was very stressed, and also impacted by a number of things, including lots of crazy invasive species. Next slide, please, Donnie. Also, worked on the latest revision of Georgia's State Wildlife Action Plan, identifying the species that are most in need of conservation attention. And between a third and a half of these species are native to the Okefenokee, and so they're already imperiled and relying on intact habitat that the Okefenokee can provide. Ready for that next slide, thanks. And so I wanted to highlight the frosted flatwood salamander for a variety of reasons. This was the initial and the highest priority of the Amphibian Foundation. And mostly because this was this is a longleaf pine endemic, and it was a common species throughout the coastal plain from South Carolina through Georgia and into Florida. And it's suffered a 90% loss in population since, well, that's supposed to say 2000, not since the year 200. And it's considered at imminent risk of extinction. So, for example, since I've been working on this species since 2012, they have not been detected in South Carolina, are considered extirpated. And in the entire state of Georgia, which was the species was once very common, they are now known from only one degraded wetland. And we just finished our field season last week for this species, and we're unable to find a single animal this year. So this is possibly extirpated from the state of Georgia as well, though we're working hard with partners to restore habitat and repopulate them back out on the landscape. So I bring this up, it's incredibly sad, especially when you love these little salamanders like this, but, it's impossible to prove extinction. We hope that there are pockets where we just have been unable to survey for these species and they're still out there. And the Okefenokee is a huge candidate, vast area that you can at least, if not hope that they're still out there somewhere, that at least the Okefenokee could provide, especially the adjacent uplands, could provide habitat where we could perhaps restore this species to. And there's no really good areas to repopulate this species because they need intact longleaf pine habitat, and that's very difficult to find. The ecosystem in general has been reduced to 3% of its historic range. So it's looking very bad for flatwood salamanders, and I like to bring up that conservation project whenever we can. Unfortunately, the flatwood salamander is only one of several species. So the next slide is the Gopher Frog, another longleaf pine endemic. It's Georgia's rarest frog. And so this is another species that we've been working with since 2009, head starting gopher frogs and releasing them back out into protected habitat. And so this is another species. It's doing better than the flatwood salamander, but it's still restricted to a handful of wetlands or populations in Georgia, and is another longleaf pine endemic. Shares habitat with some of the species that were already mentioned today, like indigo snakes, and in the uplands of Okefenokee are gopher tortoises, and there's a strong relationship between the gopher frog and the gopher tortoise, in that the gopher frog uses the burrows dug out by the gopher tortoise. Gopher frog likes to live underground, but is apparently too lazy to dig its own burrows, so it uses the burrows of a gopher tortoise. Lots of species, up 300 species of animals use gopher tortoise burrows. So gopher tortoise is another extremely important species to this ecosystem. Next slide. And then the striped newt is it's a delightful little newt, and it lives just in Florida and Georgia, the only two states where this species occurs. And it's just also known from another handful of wetlands. And the newts need not just the wetlands, but the uplands. And that is the case with all of these species too. So when we're talking about the hydrology being altered from potential mining, you know, as far as the amphibians go, there's lots of other pressures too that they need adjacent uplands, and they are migratory, not in the same way that these birds are migratory. For, you know, for a salamander, a migration might be 500 meters tops. But you know, if the hydrology in the uplands are disturbed, or if logging roads or mining roads are put in through their habitat that they're forced to cross, obviously amphibians don't do very well on the roads. And, you know, so keeping Okefenokee just as it is, because it's perfect now, would be obviously the best chances for these imperiled amphibians to survive. Next slide. Oh, that's it for me. Thank you very much. And I will pass it over to, I think, Bob.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Mark.
Sure.
So before we get to comments, we'll put in a plug here for y'all to please send your comments and concerns to Georgia EPD. They are making their decision as we speak, and need to hear from the public about how important the swamp is to you, and why, you know, what your specific concerns are about the proposal here. I just put in the chat this Protect Georgia link, which is a way to automatically send comments, but we'd also encourage you to send a personalized note via email there, including your name, you know, how you use the Okefenokee, how you want to use the Okefenokee swamp, and yeah, your concerns. And so with that, I will turn it back to Dottie.
Okay, thanks y'all. If you have any questions, thank you to all of our presenters for that very thorough explanation. That was, I actually learned things, and I've been very close to this issue for a while now. So we have a few questions that have come in. It looks like some have been answered, but I'm not sure that people have seen the answers, so I'm going to go ahead and ask them. Bob, what exactly is being mined or proposed to be mined?
Yeah, it is. It's referred to as heavy mineral sands. It's sand, and then they put it in a big like centrifuge type deal and extract specific minerals that contain things like titanium dioxide and zirconium, and then Twin Pines would sell those minerals to producers. It's most likely that the titanium dioxide would end up at a paint manufacturing company. It's used whiten paint and then other materials.
How did we prevent the previous mining before? You said the DuPont mine had been stopped. How did that happen? And is there any hope of that happening again with this issue?
That is a great question, and yes, we have hope that can happen again here. In the 90s, DuPont had those tracks just to the north of where Twin Pines is right now. There was similar public outcry to what's been happening lately. DuPont agreed to have sort of a mediated sit down with environmental organizations and local organizations to kind of discuss their plans and how best to use the land that they had, and decided and committed to not mine that property, and they donated it to the refuge.
Okay, somebody's asking, saying that the Protect Georgia link doesn't work, or we will send this out tomorrow in an email, and you should be able to click on it. We'll make it clickable. I don't know how to tell you to grab it out of the PowerPoint presentation, but it was live 10 minutes before this presentation. So I know that it's working. I'll throw this out there. Bob, this sounds like another one for you. Are these minerals tied to specific producers which we could write to? Are there other producers that produce similar products without using titanium dioxide or zirconium?
The short answer is no. Twin Pines doesn't have to reveal who they want to sell to, and we don't know. There's a number of companies that do it, including like Chemours, which was DuPont. And whether there's other materials that can be used kind of depends on what the end product is. In some instances, yes. In other instances, no. Titanium dioxide is preferred to lead, which used to be used to whiten paint. But it's also available in other areas that aren't right next to the Okefenokee Swamp too. And so that's kind of the key distinction here.
SELC was instrumental in helping Virginia to stop uranium mining. How is SELC playing a role in this issue, or are the courts involved?
The courts are not involved, although I would not be surprised if some of these issues did end up in court down the road. Kind of depends on what the agencies do. At this point, Twin Pines hasn't started mining. The agencies haven't given the go-ahead or even really reviewed all of the materials yet. And so I can't say whether we will or won't bring litigation over this issue, but it certainly raises a lot of legal questions.
One thing I'd like to jump in on that, Dottie, is that SELC has shown great leadership in pulling together this coalition, and Bob and Ann, Anna, and Bill Sapp have really been a lot of the glue that holds us all together. And so I would like to recognize them for that. So I don't think we'd be here today if it was not for them. So thank you.
Absolutely not. Lee asks, she says that these minerals have been mined in Northeast Florida in the past. Are there any reports from the effects of those mines?
This is Charles, and I made allusion to some of that. I alluded to some of that. The mining in that part of Florida our takeaway from that is that they have not been particularly good stewards. You can even go on Google Earth and Google that area of that I was showing between Stark and McLeany, and see that there are parts of it that almost have a moonscape appearance. So yes, that was part of our concern, and it's been a at best, it's been a very complex relationship. At worst, it's been something worse. And I can let others fill in because they may know more.
Thanks, Charles. Bob, do you have anything to add to that? Christian, anybody? Somebody asks if there is an opportunity to work with a group like the Nature Conservancy to purchase or annex these nearby lands, or is it too late for that?
Well, I mean, that is how the DuPont project was resolved, is that a group like the Nature Conservancy got conservation easements over the land, and Fish and Wildlife Service took ownership of some of it. And so that opportunity is definitely still there.
The opportunity is certainly there, but the political will to sell right now is not. So we've got to get Twin Pines to the point where they're willing to entertain that prospect before we can realistically have conversations about that sort of thing right now, which is why it's so important for you guys to comment here. And so to get us to get EPD to reject these permits, and then we can figure out longer term solutions after that.
Here's a good one. How are local residents responding to the aspect of the mine?
This is Charles, and I'll take first crack at that. We've, as recently as Easter weekend, before the Friday and Saturday before, we had a table at Swamp Fest, and we've been at several local festivals. There's been good support to our opposition voiced through OPA, and a big focus for our outreach is at that local level. The Charlton, Camden County, and Ware County, particularly for this part, this along Trail Ridge. That being said, there is a faction in the county that does support this as for its jobs growth potential. So one of the things we're doing is trying to balance what the existing jobs are and help people to understand the existing jobs and what's provided by the mine versus what could be in jeopardy if the mine came in. Christian might be able to address some of those economic issues because that's been something that we've been having to deal with.
Yeah, so I mean, just from an economics perspective, the Fish and Wildlife Service has studied the benefits of the refuge. And out of the nearly 600 units, it's in the top 10 in terms of economic output. And it brings in as many as 700,000 visits per year, supports over 750 local jobs, and pumps about 64 million into local communities every year. So, you know, this place is really important, not only biologically, but from an economic perspective as well. And from what the service knows is that, at least according to visitor surveys, is that, you know, if the swamp is compromised or damaged in some way, tourism is likely to shrink by at least half. You know, so there are very real economic considerations on the line here too.
Thank you, Kristen. Okay, you mentioned that the swamp is poised to be designated as protected as a World Heritage Site. What can be done to move that forward so that the mining potential can be quashed, or can anything be done?
Well, it's a long process, to put it simply. Right now, it's on the tentative list for World Heritage status. So the Department of the Interior would have to develop a nomination package to submit. And from what we know, the Okefenokee is a priority and it's at the top of the list. Folks can help usher that along though by voicing their support for that to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. You know, they're ultimately gonna be largely responsible for developing that package and shepherding it along through government. So to the extent that you can reach out to regional leadership and encourage them to move that process along, that would have an impact and would be helpful.
Donna asks why we did not address the diversity of plant species and ecologies in this presentation, and we were just, it was certainly an oversight, and there are certainly many, many unique plant species to the Okefenokee Swamp. We just were trying to cover some of the aspects and still have time for questions at the end, but there are definitely plant considerations in the swamp. Somebody's asking about a recording. Yes, we will make this recording available, hopefully by tomorrow. Here's a good one. What's the likelihood that somebody in the local, that the people in the local community have the expertise needed to be a labor pool for the mine?
That's an interesting question. I'm not 100% sure. One thing that is stuck out in these in Twin Pines statements about how many jobs will be coming is that the number has changed a lot, and we haven't really seen much to like verify exactly how many jobs there would be. You know, interestingly, when they were shrinking the project over these times, in places the number of jobs went up, even though the number of years went down, and so it's hard to say whether they bring folks from Florida to do some of those positions or hire entirely locally. We just don't know.
Okay, that about wraps up the questions we've had and brings us to the top of the hour. Thank you to everybody who has stuck with us, and a special thank you to Bob and Charles and Mark and Adam and Christian for joining us this evening. We hope you all learned a lot, and we encourage you to get your letters in. As we mentioned, we're recording this, and we will be trying to send you an email link tomorrow, and we'll also include the link to the Protect Georgia alert, though I noticed that Bob put that in the chat box as well, so you should be able to grab it out of there. But I thank everybody for coming, and we hope you have a good evening, and send your letters in. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.